the story behind this book is kind of funny because it's actually Arjun's first book. When he was started out, we
in my callow youth.
In your callow youth, he was walking around with the weight of the world on his shoulders, trying to be a writer. We only knew each other because we acted in a play in college. Acted is a strange word to use. And I'm very, very pleased that the book has finally come out. And it's such an amazing piece of work, and it gives me great pleasure to launch the book.
Thank you.
I'm going to keep it.
Nice. That's the best way to.
And thank you, and I hope it'll have all the success of all the years that you've had in making it and making it fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and welcome to this session on how the echoes of history shape our lives. I think one of the two general misconceptions about history that we have, say when we learn history in school, is that on the one hand, one comes away thinking it's a very clear distinction between good guys and bad guys in history. And I deliberately use the word guys here because I think that's maybe the third misconception, that history making and history writing is mostly a thing done by guys. And the other one is that history is something that is apart from us, that is from the distant past, and that has very little connection with our progressive present. And there were many aspects of all three of our panelists' books that I was very impressed with. But I think one of them was exactly this sense that it was only through ambiguity, it is through ambiguity that we realize that history doesn't have this clinical separation between good guys and bad guys, between the distant past and our present. And it was, in my case, personally, for me, through reading a lot that I realized that these are misconceptions, that this is not true. And having read all three of these recent books of our panelists, I felt that the impetus, I think, for all three books came by asking the right questions, honest questions, questions that maybe don't even have answers, but to try to nonetheless explore these questions. And it is this sense of ambiguity that all three books share. And so perhaps we could even retitle this session today to name it not how does history shape our lives, but how does it control our lives? Because having read all three books, you realize that history has a much stronger hold on us than we perhaps like to admit. That history is in everything we do, even if we're not aware of it. And that this linguistic separation between the past and the present, therefore, may not always apply and may not even be a valid notion. So I'd like to begin and start off this session with a quote from James Baldwin, which is, history, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. Arjun, I'd like to begin with you. Your protagonist is what we might call an unlikable narrator, which is one of my favorite kinds of narrators. It's a very difficult narrator to write because it encapsulates and embodies the sense of ambiguity that I just mentioned. Do you agree with the Baldwin quote, or what is your take on the Baldwin quote? People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your protagonist and how much of you is in him?
Well, I don't want to be unlikable, so I'm going to deny that.
No, not you, your narrator, your protagonist.
I do agree with the Baldwin quote. I think also that unless we learn from, you see, history, one of the things we often forget, especially in India, is history is ruined for us in classrooms because it's reduced to this sort of broad sweep of generic facts. I think, and what all three of you do very well, Aanchal in particular, is you personalize history for the reader. And that, to me, is what is important about history, because that's the only real legacy that we receive free of charge. And it's the only legacy that lasts. And I mean, as I'm sure all of us will touch on this at some point, I'm extremely Punjabi. it's inescapable, and I didn't realize this until my mid-20s, and I didn't realize the weight of history that came with being a member of this people. And a large part of it, I think, if we don't learn from the mistakes that history has to teach us, the mistakes that have been made, we are bound to make them again. I think it's often mistakenly accredited to, is it John Locke, I think? I'm not sure, but anyway, sorry, to come back to what I was saying, history it's something that is very, very important to me. And I don't just mean the dates that we read about in textbooks. I mean the things, how people lived their lives, the philosophies they believed in. I want to know all that. I want to know everything about what they ate, what they drank. I want to know the prejudices that they had. That's what excites me. And I think history is also cyclical. It tends to repeat itself whether we want it to or not, you know, and I think it's inescapable, particularly if you're an Indian. I mean, we are staggering under the weight of so much history that and in Punjab in particular, it's reached a point where it's turned into a form of denial, where, you know, my grandmother used to say, and who's a big part of this book, my grandparents, she used to tell me when I was a child that Punjabis died during partition. Everyone in Punjab is dead, and we're all ghosts. That's why we sing and we dance and we drink and, you know, we fight, because for a moment it reminds us that we aren't ghosts, that we are alive. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the aspects of your book, which is an extremely moving and heartbreaking story of a young man. It starts in his childhood, and then it progresses through his life as he comes of age. Is that he is a very fallible, vulnerable character, someone who is, as you said, marked deeply by the scars of history, and for a long time is not aware of that. And by the time he realizes what's going on, it may or may not be too late. That, I think, is up to each reader to decide for themselves. So let me come back to your protagonist again. Was it challenging to write in a way? I think for me personally, as a writer, one of the hardest things to do is to write violence, for example, or to write these moments of ambiguity. Perhaps you disagree with the word unlikable character. What I mean by that is that it's someone who has very obvious faults, a narrator, a protagonist who has obvious faults, but at the same time is written so convincingly that we would still follow this narrator everywhere. And that's no easy feat to achieve as a writer.
Well, honestly, I agree with you. He's extremely unlikable. I dislike him intensely. It's one of the worst things that can happen when you find yourself loathing your protagonist. And I mean, I wish I could find him and give him a good tight slap, because he spends most of the book whining. And he's a whiny fellow, and I don't like whiny people. But I think also, you mentioned flaws. I think we are all incredibly flawed individuals in some way or the other. In fact, anyone who denies that perhaps is the most flawed of them all. But I find flawed people much more compelling than people who apparently don't seem to be flawed, who, you know, and I come back to what this is a book I actually wrote when I was 25. I'm 46 now, and as a 46-year-old, I really dislike the character. I wish I could go back and, but then I don't think the book would work if he wasn't. You know, somebody gave me a wonderful compliment. They told me he's like a Punjabi Holden Caulfield, which I felt was unnecessary praise. But I think it's, I don't think we can look at the broad tapestry of suffering without people who struggle with it. And that's what humanizes it. And if you don't humanize, and particularly, I mean, the events of partition, the events of 1984, Aizawl, these are things that have to be humanized. You have to make it, you have to allow people to connect to it. And the only way to connect to it is at a visceral human level. Which is why I think his flaws, my character Himmat, his flaws, he's a real person. He's not me. I know him. I've grown up with this person. So I think it works for him. And yeah, I let's call him unlikable, but there's hope. Yeah.
Hannah, let me turn to you. What do you make of this Baldwin quote of people being trapped in history and history being trapped in them, and of how to negotiate that through storytelling and fiction?
Yeah, I totally agree with the Baldwin quote, because I think, yes, we are trapped in histories. Because through the course of me writing this book, I interviewed more than 20 people who must have been 12, 13 years old during the bombing of Aizawl. So what I realized was that they are still very, stuck in that time, because the trauma and whatever they experienced during the insurgency was, it shaped their, way of thinking, their outlook towards life, and those kind of things. For instance, one of the old women that I interviewed told me that she, whenever she, she get the smell of burnt wood, it would trigger that memory of the bombing. So those are the kind of, I think, simple ways in which people are still trapped in history. And it's also one of the reasons why I made this into a children's book, because I think it's very important to understand what our parents and grandparents have gone through in order to, bridge the generational gap. And I think it also shaped a lot of the ways in which we as a tribal community have an attitude towards, so to say, the mainland India, because the Indian Army occupation in Mizoram was for like 20 years. And a lot happened during that time. And it really shaped the attitude of the older generation towards mainland. Because even till today, we still have many of the grandparents who are very hesitant to leave Mizoram, because, anyone that, any man that they meet having a mustache would, kind of represent the Indian Army guy for them. So, yeah, people are still very much stuck in history, and I think it's important for the younger generation to understand that, so that we would know why they are hesitant to leave their community, why they have this kind of attitude towards certain people, and those kind of things, yeah.
And I think that's where fiction has this great power to achieve something that maybe, his school lessons in history don't. You mentioned the mustache. It's such a small detail, but as soon as you said the word, I think all of us, or most of us, would immediately know what you were talking about and make the connection to the army. And, in your book with the beard as well, the book opens with the grandfather's beard, and it's a trope that runs through the whole book. What does the beard represent? And I think this is something where the ordinariness of war, of trauma, of grief, of conflict can be conveyed in a way that whole history lesson or whole lifetime of history lessons may not be able to do that, because, as Arjun said, it humanizes the situation for us. It captures the profundity and the depth of the grief, and touches us in a way that maybe other things cannot. Anchal, in your extremely also very moving and impressive work, which I think is, those of you who have read it will know that it's kind of an archive in itself, in the number of interviews that this book contains on partition and the aftermath of it. Your book is nonfiction. However, for me, it struck me, reading it, how important this idea of storytelling is in remembering and in memory. How do you feel about that? And was there ever a moment, or is there still a moment, when you feel you would like to write it in fiction? Have you ever thought about writing fiction? Or to what extent did maybe elements of fiction writing bleed into your work?
Well, I think something like partition, as magnanimous as partition, we don't always receive it as history, despite what we may learn about in school, where Arjun is right, it's taught in a very meager way. It's taught with dates and facts and numbers and politicians, and it doesn't really trickle down into the common person ever. So our first instinct when we read about something like partition, which is so much further back in history than 84, is not to come back home and say, oh, well, what was this partition? Did you live through it? It is just simply to understand that this is an event that happened so far back in history that it cannot impact your present. However, history kind of seeps into our bodies, whether we like it or not, and it begins to define not only people who lived through that history, but the descendants of those people in ways that we don't expect, in very common mannerisms and habits. The mustache is one. Eating a certain food that you were forced to eat during partition for months at end is another. A certain smell will trigger something. Frugality, these are really common things, and younger people are often really dismissive of their parents and grandparents when we encounter them. We are cruel to them for them because we don't understand the impact that it has on them, but eventually at some point in our life will have on us. So I guess during the course of the last 10 years, I have interviewed survivors and their descendants across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh to understand whether partition is still relevant, how we receive it, what is the passage of memory from one generation to the other, because in my case, I never received any stories. And it was not until I asked with purpose did I receive. And even then, when you ask the question, events of trauma in South Asia are unique, then maybe not, I don't know. But I find that in asking the question, I was asked more questions about that question. If I were to ask my grandfather, what did you see at the time? You were 19. Were you scared? His first reaction was always, well, why do you want to know? And what will it change? And this incredible reluctance and hesitation to delve into something that is so old, but sort of lives at the fringes of your memory and can spill open and unpredictably behave in ways that you don't want it to. I think it's always, what I'm trying to say is you can't get people to speak about something unless they are ready. And even when they have agreed to talk to you, they may not want to do it at that moment. They may take their time. In doing that, I think fiction sometimes gives us a gentler way to enter into these conversations, even though we may have done our field research through these oral testimonies. They are quite stark, and they are as you expect them to be, but somehow far worse. The worst imaginable parts of human history, of what people did to one another. And so maybe the trope of fiction sometimes allows us to maybe confront it more directly, because we are putting it in this imaginary world. And to your point of whether I have thought to write fiction, it's weird, it's so opportune for me to say this now. I have a novel coming out in December about partition. Claps are yet to be seen, I don't know, but it's very complicated writing about it as a historian and then using the same subject matter to write fiction.
Interesting. Well, 2 points I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned. The reluctance of memory being passed from generation to generation and encountering this reluctance to talk about it. And then the flip side of that, which is also in your book, which is this idea of inherited trauma, that the generation that experienced this conflict will have certain mannerisms and certain fears that are very directly expressed in their behavior. But trauma can be inherited as well, we know today, and not just psychologically, interestingly enough, meaning not just certain mannerisms that might get passed down, which, someone might have a fear of dogs or of men or I don't know what, and never know why because they never experienced, but maybe the grandparents experienced something and this trauma is inherited through psychological mannerisms. But we even know today that it doesn't change the genetic code of the progenitors, but it changes the way the genes are expressed. So there's even a genetic repercussion in that. So from that perspective, of course, we must say that in terms of the future of mankind, it is incredibly important that we deal with our traumas, that we deal with society's traumas, and address them in ways that can secure a healthy future for the children that grow up in these societies. And the other point, of course, is that it's interesting. You both mentioned kind of this history versus history with a capital H, in the sense that, of course, what is taught in schools might be considered history and legitimate history, but there's so much history and so much conflict and strife and trauma that is experienced by regional communities, societies, that doesn't even make it into the history books. And then there is that whole question of legitimacy and how do we talk about it, and that then it's not maybe even so surprising that the elder generation might be dismissive of it, because they themselves were told this is not important, and this was your family's problem or something. It's not a larger problem that is valid and that has that gives us a legitimate reason to talk about it.
May I add something to
Yeah,
that point? Because I'm what you would call an oral historian, which is a historian of oral testimony or people's stories. And the one thing that we encounter is from archival historians is that how can you trust this version of history? How can you trust someone's memory? But what I want to say is we really take for granted that the archive is truth somehow. If something is written down, and if something is, say, in the British Library or the National Archives in India, we assume that that's truth. However, that's also one version of it, someone's version of it. So why is your grandmother's version or your aunt's version or your grandfather's version not another version of it? And I think the strength in oral history is that it provides you the diversity of storytelling from a particular period. Peoples that have been rendered invisible by official archive can find voice and dignity in it. And to your, what was the other point you just made?
The inherited trauma.
Right. I also want to say that people don't really realize they have inherited anything for that matter until they are confronted with what they don't expect. For instance, you and I last night were speaking about the fact that not enough Indians even realize that there's a Punjab in Pakistan.
Right.
And that Punjab is far larger than the Punjab in India because the Punjab state to India is so central to the nation state. And when we encounter Punjabi, Pakistani Punjab, it really throws us off, you know? So small things like that.
Sorry, if I may add something as well. I think another thing about, you can't talk about trauma without talking about cultural identity. You know, archival history, as Aanchal put it so well, is, yes, it's shaped by politics, by the narrative is shaped by the people in power, and it changes as time changes. But in the case of most of the people who endured these horrific events, they don't really care about what the politics of the moment were. You know, 1984, I've spoken to people who couldn't give a hoot about Indira Gandhi. They didn't. For them, the real villain isn't Indira Gandhi; it's the Punjab police. You know, but what, along with generational trauma and as a factor that shapes cultural identity, I think silence is a massive and silence is deeply contagious. Even today, if you travel through Indian Punjab or Pakistani Punjab, or you speak to the Sindhi community, you ask them about partition, the first thing they'll tell you is, "Hum un cheezon ke bare mein baat nahi karte." We don't talk about those things. You know, if you go to Punjab today in India, there's a very low quantity of the Muslim population is very low. And if you ask that question, that why aren't there more Muslims in Punjab, they'll tell you, "Wo yahan rehte hi nahi." Because that generation, in a silent manner, I think it's a form of osmosis. It seeps into, as she said very accurately, as you said very accurately, it seeps into every facet of your life.
And I think the problem is that silence is something that then becomes ossified and becomes accepted as a form of life, as a form of...
it's actually one of the most vocal forms of communication.
Right, yeah.
The things you have to be silent about, I think.
So to return to this question of language and storytelling, Hannah, in your novel, Rini, one of the protagonists, debates at some point whether to write in English or in Mizo. Did you ever ask yourself that question in writing this book?
Not really. I've always felt that I need to write it in English because the bombing of Aizawl, the insurgency, it's always been a very muted and silent part of history, even in you know, the whole discourse of Northeast and the Indian national narrative. So I felt I felt like writing in English was very necessary because it's a story that I have to, you know, put it out there for, you know, the public to talk about. And I think one of the small achievements in writing about it in English is that we get to talk about it in places like here. So because you know, one of the things that I really one of my main aim of writing was, you know, to tell the story of not just my mother, but my people, my history, my culture. So, yeah, English was always the first choice, yeah.
Great. Well, I think at that point it would be nice to hear that voice. If you could read us a brief excerpt from your novel.
Yeah, so just to give a very small introduction, my novel is centered on the bombing of Aizawl in 1966, which started the 20-year-long insurgency in Mizoram. So through the course of my interview, I interviewed one professor who was 12 years old during that time, and when I asked him what his first impression of the plane was, he said that he saw it as a small blackbird in the sky. So I think that really reflects the innocence of children and how naive they were about what was going to happen. So I'll just read this part where they saw the planes coming. I am about to walk into the next house when I hear a small buzzing sound. I halt. Then it gets louder and louder. People step out of their houses, including Pulal Moana and his wife. What is that sound? Asked Pikimi, who is doing laundry near the steel tank in front of our house on the opposite side of the street from where I am standing. As the sound grows louder, more people come out. Pa, look, shouts one kid standing at a few feet from me. He is pointing upwards, towards a small hillock. As all heads turn towards that direction, we see it. One small black object appears in the sky, then another. They look like the blackbirds that come to my window in the morning. They seem pretty harmless, circling in peaceful motion on the endless blue canvas. The older men seem intrigued, but they try their best to hide it. Those look like planes, exclaims Pulal Moana, who is standing on the porch next to his wife. I focus my eyes to look more clearly, and yes, they are planes, black planes. Meanwhile, the children are jumping restlessly, literally trying to grab the attention of the pilots, flailing their arms and screaming at the top of their lungs. I wonder which group I should be in. I decide to just smile at the planes. Not just any normal planes. Those look like jet fighters, says one of the men. His voice is deep and hollow. Why are they here? Are those Indian Army planes? What's going to happen? Let's go closer to look at those, screams one of the kids. The entire neighborhood is out on the streets. Everyone is looking towards the small hillock. Questions are flying everywhere. The planes come closer and we can see them more clearly as they circle over the hillock. All those years of spelling out AIRPLANE and never actually seeing one except in drawings are coming to a close. The noise is strangely small, though it is growing louder and louder. Then one of the planes moves towards our locality. It's coming this way, I shout at the top of my lungs. I know I want nothing more than to be right below this thing as it flies by. My mind flips through different positions. For a moment, I consider running up the porch on one of the nearby houses. But even while I am calculating my odds of maybe even touching the plane's belly, a loud roar crosses over my head, which is followed by the shrill screams of women and children. Clouds of dust and dry leaves cover the entire street. Has it touched me instead? I spin around full circle, and to my horror, the plane has already passed. It is now disappearing slowly into the distance and circling back to the hillock. I am so excited that I can actually still hear it in my brain, the low thrum that gradually becomes louder, the kind of noise I imagine I would hear if I were to bring my head close to a Jeep engine while it was running. Then I realize the noise is not in my mind, it's another plane. This time I keep my eyes resolutely on it, refusing to be distracted. I am determined to catch a closer look at the majestic steel bird since I have already missed my first chance. Bring us toys from across the sea, one of the younger girls shouts. I do not want toys, I just want to see a plane up close. I know I am going to this time. This one is coming straight in my direction. But much to my disappointment, it moves towards another locality. This doesn't look good. I hear one voice rising above the noise. Yes, those are surely jet fighter planes, shouts one of the younger men. Then suddenly the planes start shooting rapidly as they circle the small hill. It is then that we know why the planes have come. Screams and cries follow the booming sound as people run inside their homes for shelter. The thundering sound almost drowns the screaming voices. Air cannons, they're shooting with air cannons, screams a man from one of the houses. The sound of the guns firing is like hundreds of giant tigers roaring together all at once. It is the most horrific sound I have ever heard in my entire life. A canopy of thick dust immediately covers the hillock, engulfing everything in sight. It is as if the sky itself has burst into fragments. I am in shock. I cannot tell where exactly the planes had dropped the bomb, but I know Father's school is just below the hillock. People rush past me from all directions. I am panicking. I look around and see people run into their houses, slamming their doors shut. As I turn my head towards the hillock, I see something dropping from the planes. The moment it disappears into the smoke, there is a loud roar of explosion, and immediately flames roar upwards. Not knowing what to do next, I run into the house nearby, which is the closest from where I am standing. The moment I reach the kitchen, there is another explosion, and then another one. I can hear screams coming from every direction, people calling out for one another in fear and horror. My city has been turned into dust. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Did you feel that the childhood, the child perspective, the child protagonist, was that the only way you could tell the story, or did you consider other narrators too? Because for me, that was one of the most striking elements of the book, the fact that you have this very young, naive protagonist who's looking onto these very horrific events with with this naive perspective, and you're playing with that beautifully.
Yeah, so when I was doing my research for this book, what I found out was that the historical accounts and the political accounts that we have about the insurgency and the bombing are all, mostly political blame game where people point fingers at each other. It's the Indian Army's fault. It's the fault of the MNF rebels. So I couldn't really decide which narrative to stick with. It's either the Indian Army narrative or the anti-Indian Army narrative. So what I decided was to have a very neutral perspective on this. It would be best to narrate the story from the child's perspective because that's, I think the perspective is very pure and, even from their judgment or their impression of the planes, I think we best see history from the eyes of children because that's, I think, one of the most unbiased perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And perhaps brings us back to that sense of ambiguity again, that
yes.
it's not one or the other's fault
Yes.
necessarily, it's more complicated than that. Arjun, to get back to you, I have one question for you before I would like to ask you to read us a brief excerpt, which is one of the things that interested me a lot when I was reading your book, which was there to a certain extent in the other two books as well, but in your book in particular, which is that there's on and off mention of a certain class dimension to the conflict. There's a moment where the police havildar says to the family, you rich Punjabis, in a kind of accusing way to justify the violence that they have just done unto the family. And then it's there later again when the family meets a former student who has become a terrorist, and he also mentions this kind of that it's about the discrepancy between rich and poor, and that he mentions the Russian Revolution as an inspiration. Is that something you think is central in a way to 1984 and to partition before that? How much of it is really ethnic and religious violence, and how much of it is, do you think, also a class struggle? The fact that there's that kind of economic discrepancy, injustice, and that this kind of violence is used almost as an excuse to undo that?
Well, I think ethnicity and class are inseparable from, ethnicity and religion are inseparable from class. the ethnic conflicts that we are seeing in India and the ethnic conflicts that we were seeing in the 80s, certainly across India, arose because of, it was there's a wonderful German word, a Kulturkampf, a clash of cultures, where you were seeing classes that had been traditionally, that were considered downtrodden. I mean, even the term, I'll give you an example. Gandhiji said untouchables is a bad phrase, let's call them Harijans, which actually a great many people who fell into the untouchable classes found offensive. And that's what happens. Broad categorizations are made. Things, I won't say the people in power, but the powers that be decide to do certain things without considering it's a trickle-down effect. And generally the people who are hit the hardest and who react the most violently are always the poorest. And there's, at least I can't speak for the rest of India, I'm not an expert. I'm certainly not an expert about Punjabi affairs either, but in my experience, class struggles of two kinds. One is the deep-seated caste systems that are intrinsic to every facet of Indian society, but also wealth has come. In fact, that's the reason why you don't see anyone talking about Khalistan today, because they're amongst the richest people in the world. Wealth is what has cured these social evils and the rise of the downtrodden classes who are now in power. And the reason why the attitudes that are reflected here, they aren't necessarily my personal attitudes, but you can't, that's the other thing about history, you can't write about an event which is, I find it hilarious that something that happened 30 years ago is now considered history. I think in some places something that happened 30 minutes ago might be considered history as well. But you can't write about events that happened without talking about every facet of every subsection of society that suffered it. And Khalistan, while partition is something that is a much, much more complex issue, Khalistan really came down to a very simple thing. The have-nots wanted what the haves had. Which is actually not a bad children's book. Terrifying, but and so many of the young men who picked up AK-47s, they picked them up because they would rather die with a gun in their hand than starve. And even today, the class system has not changed. There's a new phenomenon in Punjab. It's called guns, guts, and glory, where you have a 79% graduation rate thanks to the DAV colleges, where almost everyone is doing a master's degree now. And they don't want to go back and become farmers because they feel it's beneath them. So they end up turning to a life of crime. A great many, I mean, we all hear about the drug epidemic in North India. The same issues, what's happened is how should I say, the issue is the same, it's just how people are reacting to it has changed. And what happened in 1984, I think it was just a series of unfortunate events that sort of culminated in there's no other word for it. It was genocide. It was a pogrom, and there's no escaping it. And what the reason why it's a very heavy subject to talk about. I'm trying my best not to crack a bad joke and embarrass myself, but you can't talk about the events that happened in Punjab without talking about class, because even today, the people. So Punjab has three regions: the Majha, the Doab, and Malwa, and there are these rivalries that go back to the era of Alexander the Great. There's a tribe called the Gils who believe themselves to be direct descendants of Seleucus. There's another group called the Sandhus and the Walias who believe they're the real kings of Punjab because the Sandhan Walias were displaced by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And the irony of it, the funny part, if you do a deep dive and you try to read about the antecedents of Punjab and Haryana and even Rajasthan, everyone is an immigrant. And it's that denial of history which has created so much history. So it's incredibly ironic. And the class system is inescapable.
On that note, we'd love to hear a brief excerpt from you. We're running out of time a little bit, but
well, I'll do a very brief bit. Aanchal's book is very compelling, and we have to hear from it. Okay, I'm just Guilt, Putter, is in our blood, in our very souls here in Punjab, as intrinsic to our existence as suffering. For thousands of years we have suffered. The Aryans, the Greeks, Aurangzeb, the English, Jallianwala, partition, Haryana, and of course Blue Star. But still we remain optimistic. Still, we remain indomitable. Do you know why? He gave me a sorrowful smile. It's because of what Nanak has taught us, Putter. Suffering is the ultimate test. It is the crucible in which the truth of a man's nature is tested. That is where real heroism comes from. Not just from standing up for something, but also for having the strength to survive even when you are not strong enough to take a stand. That is what character is. To never let adversity break you, to never let suffering break you. Because a man is not defined by happiness. He is defined by his regrets, my son. And it is his choice if he chooses to let them cripple him or if he decides to be elevated by them. That, in many ways, is the only real choice any of us have. That is what makes us great, us Punjabis. It has taken us a very long time and a crapload of suffering. But like the Jews and Irish, we have taught ourselves how to suffer with grace. We laugh and drink and sing and dance and pretend we are fools, but it is all a lie. The truth is that we have become adept at hiding our pain, our collective sorrow, the amputation of our spirit. We have become experts at hiding how broken we are, how damaged. We are all liars, Putter. We lie to the world, to each other, but most of all we lie to ourselves, just so that we can go on day after meaningless day.
Thank you, Arjun. And I'd like to pick up something from this section, which circles back again to maybe our theme of this session, of ambiguity, this fusion perhaps of the perpetrator and the victim. And this is something that brings me, Aanchal, to your book. One of the most chilling sections of your book are the ones where you talk about interviewing people who consider themselves or descendants of the perpetrators of violence. And I wanted to ask you, do you think, are you okay with using words like perpetrator and victim? Do you think that's part of the problem that we use these words? Or do you think we need to call a spade sometimes? If you could just briefly go into that and then read us a brief section.
I think I would be wary to generalize anything about partition, because the minute you consider something as fact, something will counter it. You know, and it's really the diversity of stories that tell us that there's no one way to describe a partition narrative, whether of victim or perpetrator, or perhaps someone who was both at some part in the process. And there's no one way to receive it as well. So I really go story by story, interview by interview, because in the midst of a single interview, people can contradict themselves as well, and their actions and behaviors can contradict those of what they are attempting to do, right? In the face of violence, we are not thinking. But I don't want to use this as an excuse for what people did at the time. So I will read a section, and to give a little bit of context to it, stories of like loss and suffering and displacement, especially for me who lives in Delhi, are really everywhere. Delhi was flooded by migrants post-partition, and those are really the stories that you hear. However, a story of an admittance of violence is rare, and you don't really know what to do with such a story. And when I was faced with such a story, I didn't know what to do with it. So in this book, I recorded interviews in person, over email, over video calls, WhatsApp calls, letters, over a period of 9 years. So this, anyway, let me just read. You'll know what I mean. I have been privy to stories of the victims of trauma for a long time, but never had I heard a first-hand account of a perpetrator. And sometimes I did think about this, that if so many people suffered in the violence that ensued during partition, then certainly there were people committing those violent acts. A part of me thinks that this is a simplistic and reductive way to think about it because I wasn't there, and I did not see the events unfold, and there are many other facets to consider. But even writing these sentences down is difficult, because for far too long, the mob, the rioter, the violent body has been a faceless, ambiguous one. But when engaging with an individual's memories of perpetrating violence, we are assigning a face to that violence, no matter how many decades older it may be. And on that note, I have wondered whether and how such a story is passed down generations, how it is discovered, received, treated, whether there is any context provided, any reason, or even any remorse. But I had never been in a position to ask, and so when such a story was told to me, I found myself in difficult, uncharted territory. When I receive an email from A, it reads, I have a story from partition. My distant ancestor abducted and sold many women. A gruesome tale of horror. It offers no more details, and I'm unsure of how to take this conversation forward or even conduct such an interview. There is no rule book for oral history because every situation is unique. So I write back asking whether they feel comfortable telling me about what happened at the time. The reply reads, I don't think there is any point in talking about partition if we cannot speak honestly. I am a servant of truth and of the recording of truth. And so it begins. For the next few weeks, A and I exchange emails about their ancestor, B. They start by admitting that they had not thought much about partition until they discovered the violent acts of their ancestor. They were a child when they first heard passing references to the crimes he had committed. He beguiled them by appearing helpful, gaining confidence of his victims, keeping them hopeful, and then abducting them by force with his accomplices, and then breaking their resistance. I can go on telling such stories, for such is the evil associated with his name. And then we have an email conversation for a long time. And I think what I was left with at the end of that email exchange was really a moral and ethical dilemma on how to tell such a story, because here was a person telling me about crimes committed against young women. And I was a young woman writing these stories. And the first draft that I wrote, and I thought it was very important for me to be very transparent about the fact that the historian is not without prejudice. And the historian does not feel this is not true. We may need to be removed from our subject matter, but sometimes it's really impossible to be. And so the first draft that I wrote of this story was incredibly wrathful. And when I shared it with my interviewee, who is, generations removed from this perpetrator, they were very upset for a number of reasons. I think it's interesting when people are okay speaking about things, but when you write it down and when it finds language and it finds structure, I think it dawns on you what really happened. Mm-hmm. And you are forced to accept a narrative in totality that you may only be thinking about in parts. And so that happened. But then also, I was very unfair in the telling of that story because it was flooded with prejudice and bias and flooded with anger. Because I was putting myself in that situation. And as someone attempting to be empathetic, you will always do that, but you cannot put the blame on someone who did not commit the crimes and who is courageous enough to tell you the story. Like, I just heard it. They were living with that history. And reckoning with it, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing this this very moving section as well. And I'd now like to open the floor to questions, if there's anyone. Yes, there.
Hi, so my name's Danya. I've read Remnants of a Separation, and I'm currently reading The Language of Remembering. So my question is more for Ms. Malhotra, but it's really open-ended to anyone. So you talked about reluctance to pass on memory. So I find this part really interesting. And why do you think this reluctance exists? Because even in Remnants of a Separation, the interviewees would go on and on about the objects that were connected to the partition, but would never really talk about the partition itself and would often dance around it. So why do you think this reluctance really exists?
It's hard to give a definitive answer for that because it could be different for different people. One of the things that Arjun pointed out earlier is that silence is practiced by many people. And Saskya pointed out as well that not enough people considered their stories important enough. So for example, if you see my grandparents lived in a refugee camp for 10 years and they did not think that refugee experience of living in a camp with so many other people was necessary to talk to us about because it was the ordinary for them. Everyone had undergone violence and displacement, and they did not think it was an extraordinary experience, which, of course, subsequent generations may disagree with. But I think that, in my opinion, the biggest part of the problem is that we don't actually have a language to talk about violence. And that seems ironic, because for countries in South Asia like Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh that are born from violence, that should come most naturally to us. But I'm not talking about the violence inflicted from one person upon another. I'm talking about how to live with that violence and talking about the language of loss and sadness and fear and shame and guilt and remorse. And I don't think we are comfortable enough discussing these things in families. That's why they are brushed under the rug, and that's why it says, why do you want to know? But I don't think that we are there yet, and that kind of reconciliation or reckoning to talk about these things openly. I think there will always have to be a conversation that someone else starts about it. That's why I said earlier, if you ask the question, you may receive the answer. Because by themselves, I don't think anyone will really delve into that part of their lives.
Aanchal, what do you think, just to add another dimension to that question, what do you think would have to happen on the level of policy or education for that to change?
Difficult to say. I think any policy maker or politician who is interested in looking at reconciliation on the South Asian geopolitical front needs to look at it with empathy and needs to listen to people's stories. And that doesn't just mean stories within their own country, because I do think like everything is very Indo-centric when it comes to trauma in South Asia, partition in South Asia. Even the way the three countries talk about events of 1947 and 71 is different. For India, it's always a loss. For Pakistan, it's a gaining of nationhood. For Bangladesh, 71 is far more important than 47. When it comes to 71, it is a second partition for Pakistan. It is liberation for Bangladesh. And for India, it's the third Pakistan and India war. So I don't think any law can come without empathy, because this is not just about a boundary on land. It is about people's lives that were disrupted. And I think about truth and reconciliation all the time and how those words come in an order. Without truth, there is no reconciliation. Without the understanding that the other's truth is different from your truth, there is no reconciliation. So I think, in my opinion, and I write about this in the at the end of the book, that if there is no governmental effort at reconciliation, which really people want, at least a lot of people I know are interested in seeing the lands where their ancestors come from. I know Arjun would love to go and see where his grandparents came from. I think it depends on people like writers and artists and oral historians and journalists and musicians to bridge that, to act as a bridge. You know?
Great. Well, I think, yeah. One.
My question was for Aanchal. I don't want the other two to feel neglected, but it struck me when you read your bit. Because for me, I would always focus on the victim. So the fact that what you read out was somebody who represented the ancestors who were perpetrators. You kept them anonymous because you said A and B. And I just wondered whether the gender of the person talking about the ancestral perpetrators made a difference.
The anonymity was because the interviewee asked me to. It's a man. It's a man. They are in a serving job where they can't They don't want their name out. And there are several interviews like that in the book where people just don't feel comfortable.
Would it have made a difference if it was a woman?
I wonder if the story would have ever even emerged, you know, or whether they would have shared. I mean, it's complicated. It's very complicated. I don't want to speak for some imaginary situation, but I wonder if the story would have emerged, and I wonder if they may have shared my wrath, you know.
I think we have time for one last question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My question is for Arjun, sir. When I came here, I was struck by the title of your book. So I wanted to know how did you come up with it? And what is the significance of your title?
Actually, I didn't come up with it, curiously enough.
Okay.
I wanted to call it The Anatomy of Sorrow, or The Anatomy of Scars. That's what I wanted to call the book. This was number 3 in the suggestions I gave my publisher. We agreed to call it The Anatomy of Loss, and then when they sent me the galley, it had suddenly become... we agreed to call it The Anatomy of Sorrow, and when I saw the first proof, it had been changed to The Anatomy of Loss. And it just seemed perfect. Also, it allowed me a very bad joke, because if you reverse it, it's the loss of anatomy, which is a very, very Punjabi joke. But it just... so, you know, what really we're trying to convey is that Aanchal very articulately answered that question that you asked about why people don't talk about these things. I think because there are 2 great obstacles, callousness and fear. And it's not the callousness of others. It's not their fears. You develop a certain callousness. The first time you hear a story about partition or about suffering, it's terrifying, and it makes you feel an immense sadness. The second time you hear it, there's a degree of schadenfreude, you know, where you're almost taking pleasure in the fact that you didn't have to suffer it. The third time you hear the same story, it bores you. And I think what's happening is, one of the things that we've lost as a society is we've become callous, and we've become willing to surrender to our fears easily. When you meet a survivor, survivors of anything, it doesn't have to be world-shaking events, survivors of anything are unwilling. And perhaps the most difficult thing to survive is loss. Loss of any kind. It doesn't have to be, you know, the demolition of your entire cultural identity, of who you are, of your people. Even simple losses that we face on a day-to-day basis, we are unwilling to share that. And part of it is defensive, part of it is because you're not willing to just break it down and try to understand what's happening here.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's what really The Anatomy of Loss is supposed to represent. It's about, at some point in your life, you have to stop and ask yourself a very simple question. Who am I, and what are the things that make me who I am? And these are not decisions that you've made consciously. These are decisions that have been made for you by society. If I travel, I will always be an Indian. I can't escape that. Now, how an American person perceives an Indian and how an Englishman perceives an Indian, I've been asked that, do you ride elephants to work?
Oh, yeah.
You know, I would love to have an elephant. It save me a lot of road rage. But to answer your question in a very circuitous manner, the reason why the title works, and I'm grateful to my publishers for sticking, I wanted a different cover and I wanted a different title. They stuck to their guns, and I feel it's come together very nicely, because it articulates, contrary to, okay, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say something very, very arbitrary, and then I'll keep quiet. What makes us Indian is a shared sense of sorrow and a shared sense of loss. Hannah comes from a very different part of India. Aanchal grew up in Delhi. Saskya's been away from India for a great many years, and then there's me. But I think what unifies us as a people, and this is something I think a nation is defined as a sense of shared sorrow and a common enemy. So I think that sense of shared sorrow is what we have to try and understand, because otherwise we're going to end up as lots of little Balkan republics. So,
on that note, I'd like to thank all three of you for your insights and your honest glimpses into your books. Thank you so much.